Hey guys, tonight we're talking about one of history's most despised professions, and I'm not exaggerating here. The medieval miller. Sounds innocent enough, right? Someone who grinds grain into flour. Basic survival food production. But here's the thing. Medieval peasants, merchants, nobles, everyone from the bishop to the beggar. They all looked at millers with this mixture of suspicion, resentment, and genuine fear. And not because millers were doing anything obviously villainous. They weren't running protection rackets or poisoning wells or anything like that. No, it was something far subtler and somehow more corrosive. Millers occupied a position of power that nobody else had. Power that was invisible to most people, but felt acutely in every loaf of bread on every table. They were the gatekeepers of one of humanity's most essential resources, and that gave them leverage over entire communities. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now maybe grab some bread, maybe actually look at it for a moment. Think about where it came from, how many hands touched it, how many opportunities there were for something to go wrong. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, because the story of why nobody trusted the medieval miller is also the story of how power works when nobody's watching. Picture this. You're a medieval peasant, and you've just harvested your wheat. Let's say you managed to keep maybe a quarter of what you grew for yourself. The rest goes to the Lord, the church, the king, taxes, obligations, feudal dues. But that quarter you kept, that's yours to turn into flour, into bread, into the difference between surviving winter and starving. So you take your grain to the only mill for miles around. Maybe you walk 2, 3, 5 miles. Maybe you're crossing into another lord's territory just to get there, which is technically illegal, but everyone does it anyway. It's not a pleasant journey. Your grain is heavy. The roads are terrible. Mud in spring, dust in summer, frozen ruts in winter. Your back aches by the time you get there. The miller, he's standing there by his great stone wheels, the sound of grinding stone on stone filling the air, dust floating everywhere like a flour ghost made solid. He's wet with sweat and flour dust and river spray. His hands are stained a permanent grayish white from flour that will never quite wash out. He looks at your grain and gives you a nod. Maybe he smiles. Maybe he doesn't. It's hard to read him, really. You're supposed to pay him for his work. Usually it's a percentage of what he grinds. Maybe 1/16 of the grain becomes his fee. Seems reasonable. Until you realize that he's the only one doing the measuring, the only one watching the grain go in, the only one watching the flour come out. And the mill is his domain, his space, his rules. You can't look too closely. You can't argue. You can't demand a recount. You just have to trust that he's being honest. And let me tell you, trusting a medieval miller was like trusting a tax collector who counts his own books. It was an act of faith that most people didn't have. The problem started with one very simple fact. Millers possessed a form of power that transcended normal medieval hierarchies. You could see a lord's power. He had a castle, soldiers, land. You could see a bishop's power. He had the church, the threat of damnation, pageantry. But a miller's power was hidden. It lived in the gap between what you brought in and what you took out. It lived in the moment when your grain disappeared into the depths of the mill and was transformed into something else entirely. That transformation was supposedly mechanical, impersonal, governed by the laws of physics, but in reality, it was governed by the miller. He was the only one who truly understood what happened inside his mill. The peasants didn't understand the mechanics. Most lords didn't either. The grain went in one side as whole kernels, and flour came out the other side as fine powder. Somewhere in between, the miller took his cut. But exactly how much did he take? Well, that was his secret, and unlike most medieval transactions, which happened in public, under the eyes of witnesses and authorities, milling happened behind closed doors, behind the noise of grinding stone, in the spray of water from the mill wheel. It was the perfect crime, if you could call it that. Not a crime exactly, because the miller was technically entitled to his fee. But what if he was taking more than his fee? What if his hand was constantly in the grain? What if he was so practiced at skimming extra grain for himself that no one could ever catch him? That was the real fear. Not that millers were thieves, but that they could steal in plain sight, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it. And the medieval mind, practical as it was, understood this perfectly, which is why you see references to miller theft everywhere in medieval documents. Laws were written against millers. Fines were imposed. Regulations were created. In some cities, millers were required to hang a cord or a stick from their neck so that they couldn't secretly pocket grain. Imagine that. A grown man having to wear a cord like a leash because people trusted him so little. Some mills were publicly owned specifically so that the miller didn't have a personal financial stake in cheating customers. But even public mills had their problems. A miller could still skim, could still short weight, could still claim the grain had been dampened by rain. So naturally some was lost. Naturally his percentage should be calculated on the final flour weight, not the starting grain weight. There were so many ways to manipulate the process that regulations became Byzantine. One English town required that all grain brought to the mill be weighed by an official before milling, and the flour be weighed after by the same official. But even that didn't fully solve it. A clever miller could argue that moisture loss accounted for discrepancies, that stone dust from the millstones had to be accounted for, that birds had somehow flown in during the night and stolen some of the flour. It was endless. The peasants knew they were being cheated. The lords suspected it. The authorities made increasingly desperate attempts to prevent it. But it kept happening anyway, because the fundamental problem couldn't be solved through regulation. The miller had an information advantage that no amount of rules could eliminate. Beyond the economics, beyond the measurable grain loss, there was something else that made people distrust millers. It was stranger, more primal. There was magic in what they did. The mill itself seemed alive to medieval people. The great wooden wheel turned from the power of running water, that invisible force that never stopped, never tired, responding to nothing and no one. The millstones ground with a sound like the world being remade, a deep rumbling that you felt in your bones. Grain poured in and flour came out, a transformation so complete and so mysterious that it bordered on the occult. Millers understood these machines in ways that seemed almost supernatural. They could listen to the sound of the grinding stones and know whether the mill was working properly. They could feel the vibrations through the floor and diagnose problems. They knew things about the behavior of water, about the engineering of wheels and shafts and stones that seemed like specialized knowledge, secret knowledge. And in the medieval mind, secret knowledge was dangerous. It made people uncomfortable. Millers were often portrayed in folklore as having made deals with dark forces There were stories of millers selling their souls to the devil in exchange for the ability to turn water into flour. Other stories suggested that millers used occult knowledge to enhance their theft, that they mumbled incantations over the grain to make it multiply in their pockets. Reasonable people in daylight hours might dismiss such stories, but in the dark of evening, when you thought about your grain disappearing into those stone wheels, when you thought about all the ways it could be stolen without you knowing, when you thought about the miller's strange knowledge and his control over this crucial transformation, well, maybe there was something to those stories. Maybe the miller was just extremely clever. Or maybe he was something darker. You couldn't quite rule it out. The isolation of millers made things worse. Unlike blacksmiths or carpenters or masons who worked in towns where people could watch them, millers often worked alone or with just an apprentice out at the mill, sometimes miles from town. They lived a strange, solitary life, interrupted constantly by the arrival of people bringing grain, but not staying long enough to really know the miller as a person. They saw him always in work mode, covered in flour dust, surrounded by the noise and spray of the mill, surrounded by machines that never stopped, never rested. He wasn't integrated into the social life of the community in the way other craftsmen were. He didn't sit in the tavern and gossip. He didn't attend every market day. He wasn't part of the guild system in the same way other trades were. He was defined entirely by his function, his utility, his role as gatekeeper of grain. That isolation fed suspicion. People imagined all sorts of things happening at the mill. They imagined the miller getting rich while everyone else struggled. They imagined him developing strange habits, strange thoughts, strange practices, maybe conducting secret rituals in the dark, maybe making deals with forces best left alone. Millers began to be marked as outsiders. In some medieval towns, millers weren't allowed to live within the town walls. They had to live outside, near the mill, separated from normal society. It was partly practical. The noise of the mill would disturb the town, but it was also symbolic. Millers were quarantined like they carried a disease, because in a way, they did carry something contagious. They carried power, and power was always suspect in medieval society. Power that wasn't backed by birth, by land ownership, by military force, by religious authority. Power that came just from understanding a machine and being in the right place at the right time. That kind of power was dangerous and destabilizing. It threatened the natural order. It suggested that a person could rise through intelligence and technical skill rather than through the proper channels of inheritance and hierarchy. The financial reality of milling made everything worse. If you were a successful miller, you could actually become wealthy. In a medieval economy where most people lived at subsistence level, a miller could accumulate real money. You took a percentage of every bushel of grain brought to your mill. In a densely populated area that could amount to significant wealth, you could potentially buy land, lend money, become a figure of some local importance. But that wealth was deeply resented because it came from grain, the most basic necessity, the thing that stood between communities and starvation. It felt parasitic. It felt like the miller was getting rich by taking tiny pieces from everyone's bread. The Lord's wealth came from owning land and extracting dues. That was clear and explicit. Everyone knew where it came from and why he had it. The bishop's wealth came from tithes and donations and the lands of the church. That was religious wealth blessed by God, or at least that's what people told themselves. But the miller's wealth came from 1,000 small transactions, 1,000 opportunities to skim a bit extra, 1,000 moments of opacity when no one could see exactly what was happening. It felt dirty. It felt like cheating, even when it was technically legitimate. And when it became actual cheating, actual theft, nobody was surprised, because they'd already decided that's what the miller was doing all along. The social position of millers became increasingly unstable over the medieval period. They were essential, absolutely essential. No miller meant no flour. No flour meant bread. No bread meant starvation. Communities absolutely needed millers, but they hated needing them. They resented the dependency. Some communities tried to solve this by having multiple mills, creating competition, hoping that fear of losing business would make millers honest. But that didn't really work because often the mills were in different locations and served different areas anyway. Some authorities tried imposing strict price controls on milling fees, but that just made millers resentful and created new opportunities for hidden theft. Some places experimented with communal mills, publicly owned and run by hired workers rather than independent craftsmen. But those workers had the same incentives to cheat. The fundamental problem couldn't be solved. You needed the miller, and the miller had leverage, and no amount of regulation or competition or public ownership could fully eliminate that. So the resentment just festered. It accumulated. Millers became figures of suspicion and derision. They were the targets of jokes, the villains of cautionary tales, the people everyone suspected of wrongdoing even when nothing could be proven. Their reputation preceded them. A miller traveling to another town would find himself treated with wariness. People would guard their grain carefully. They'd inspect the flour more carefully. They'd count every ounce, because millers as a profession had been marked as untrustworthy, guilty until proven innocent, and even then only provisionally innocent. There was another dimension to this that's worth understanding. Millers had access to information that nobody else had. They knew how much grain the community was producing. They knew which families were wealthy enough to bring large amounts to the mill, which families were struggling, which were on the edge of poverty. They knew when harvests were good and when they were bad. They had a window into the economic life of their community that was available to nobody else except perhaps the Lord's steward. And in medieval times, information was power. If a miller was inclined to, he could have become a confidant, a minor figure of political or economic importance. Some millers did exactly that, using their information to curry favor with lords or become minor figures in local politics. But that ambition only made them more suspect. They were already resented for their economic leverage. Adding political ambition on top of that made them seem like they were trying to rise above their station, trying to become something more than a craftsman, trying to muscle into the ranks of the gentry or the merchant class. And that was deeply threatening to the medieval social order. Your miller was supposed to stay in his place, be grateful for his position, and accept his modest wealth without trying to expand his power further. But human nature and ambition meant that the cleverest millers often did exactly that, which meant the cycle of suspicion and resentment just kept spinning. Some millers fought back against their reputation. They worked hard to build honest relationships with their communities. They were scrupulously fair with measurements, invited people to watch the milling process, tried to demystify their work. A few managed to become genuinely trusted figures in their regions. But they were the exception. Most millers just accepted that they were going to be resented, that they were going to be suspected of theft even when they weren't stealing anything, that their wealth was always going to be looked at as somewhat illegitimate. It was a bitter thing to accept. You were providing an essential service. You had real skills. You were working long hours in difficult conditions. You were feeding the community literally and figuratively. And yet you were despised. You were excluded from normal social life. You were assumed to be a thief. Your wealth, even if honestly earned, was resented. It must have been psychologically grueling. Many millers developed a reputation for being cynical, bitter, almost hostile to their customers. And that reputation only reinforced the suspicion. A hostile miller was obviously hiding something. A bitter miller was obviously guilty. The suspicion and the treatment created exactly the attitude that the community feared. And then people pointed to that attitude as proof that the miller was indeed untrustworthy. It was a vicious cycle. The miller became a kind of social pariah, essential but despised, necessary but resented, powerful but without any of the social legitimacy that made power acceptable in medieval society. Sometimes millers fought back in other ways. There are accounts of millers who became so resentful of their treatment that they actually did start skimming, did start cheating, figured if everyone was going to assume they were thieves anyway, they might as well actually deserve the reputation. Other millers got clever about it, developed elaborate schemes to steal grain without getting caught, taking such small amounts that it was hard to trace but accumulating over time into real wealth. Some became genuinely dangerous figures, exploiting their position completely, stealing openly once they figured out they could get away with it. The authorities responded by getting harsher. In some towns, millers who were caught stealing faced brutal punishments. In the Domesday Book and various medieval legal codes, there are references to harsh fines, imprisonment, even mutilation for caught millers. One miller caught systematically cheating might have his hands broken so he couldn't work anymore. Another might be publicly humiliated in the market square, stripped of his professional status. But the harsh punishments only reinforced the hostility. They made millers seem more like criminals, which reinforced the suspicion, which made more communities harsh with their local millers, which drove more honest millers to become bitter, some of whom then did become dishonest. The reputation became almost self-fulfilling. Millers were treated as untrustworthy. So many of them became untrustworthy. Then everyone could point to the crooked millers and say, "See, we were right to be suspicious all along." This entire dynamic reveals something interesting about medieval society and human nature more broadly. It shows how suspicion and resentment can be rooted in something very real, very rational even, but can still lead to outcomes that are unfair and ultimately harmful to everyone. Millers genuinely did have opportunities to steal. The position genuinely did give them leverage. But most millers probably weren't stealing, or weren't stealing much, or were stealing in the minor ways that everyone accepted as part of the system. The problem is that the opportunity for theft existed, and in human psychology, the existence of an opportunity is often treated the same way as the actual occurrence of theft. People assumed that because theft was possible, it was happening. And that assumption created a climate of suspicion so thick that it poisoned the entire relationship between millers and communities. Millers became villains in the medieval imagination, figures in stories and folklore, symbols of duplicity and greed. They were painted as the enemies of honest folk, as parasites on the community, as embodiments of hidden evil. In reality, many of them were just people trying to make an honest living in a difficult profession, dealing with machines that were dangerous, working in isolation, trying to serve their communities, even as those communities resented and suspected them. The lasting impact of this suspicion was significant. Millers never recovered their reputation. Even as medieval society evolved into the early modern period, Millers retained their bad reputation. They show up constantly in literature and folklore as figures of suspicion. The dishonest miller became a stock character in stories. In some traditions, there were actual superstitions about millers, beliefs that they could curse you or steal your soul or bring bad luck to your home. This wasn't because millers were actually doing anything supernatural. It was pure prejudice rooted in centuries of accumulated suspicion and resentment. The reputation became self-sustaining. People assumed millers were dishonest, so they treated them as outsiders. So millers became isolated and bitter, and that isolation and bitterness was interpreted as proof of their guilt. It was an injustice that many millers had to live with, the shame of a profession that was simultaneously essential and despised. Some millers tried to escape the reputation by leaving the profession. Others doubled down and made the worst assumptions about themselves true. Some managed to live good, honest lives despite the suspicion. But regardless of what any individual miller did, the profession as a whole carried a taint that never quite washed away. Looking back at this strange medieval panic about millers, it's tempting to laugh at the naivety, the suspicion, the unfairness of it all. But it actually reveals something profound about how power works in societies. When there's a gap between what people can see and what's actually happening, when there's someone occupying a crucial position who has information or leverage that others don't have, suspicion is going to bloom. It's not irrational. It's a rational response to genuine uncertainty. The problem is that once suspicion takes root, once it becomes part of the community's shared understanding of a person or group, it's almost impossible to remove. Even if you prove that a specific miller is honest, you haven't changed the underlying suspicion about millers as a category. You haven't addressed the structural reality that millers do have opportunities to steal, even if they're not taking them. The medieval solution to this problem, try to regulate it more, try to watch more closely, try to punish cheaters more severely, didn't really work because you can't legislate away suspicion. You can't make people trust through law. And the harshness of the attempted solutions probably just made things worse, feeding the perception that millers were dangerous and deserving of harsh treatment. In the end, the story of why no one trusted the medieval miller is also a story about the limits of systems and the resilience of reputation. Once a group of people gets marked as untrustworthy, that marking is incredibly hard to undo. Individual exceptions don't change the category. Personal relationships don't override the broader prejudice. Even honest behavior gets reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion. An honest miller becomes a miller who's being unusually careful because he has something to hide. A fair measurement becomes a sign that he's learned he's being watched. The benefit of the doubt that might be extended to other professions never applies to millers. They operate under a cloud of permanent suspicion, and that suspicion was born from a genuine structural problem. They really did have opportunities to cheat. The medieval community really was vulnerable to their exploitation. But that genuine vulnerability gave birth to a suspicion so encompassing, so total, that it poisoned the relationship between millers and communities for centuries. Every miller was guilty until proven innocent, and even proof of innocence was temporary, conditional, always subject to revision if suspicion arose again. It was an impossible position, and it shaped how millers saw themselves and how communities saw them in ways that echoed far beyond the medieval period. The medieval miller stands as a monument to what happens when reasonable fear becomes irrational prejudice, when structural problems are responded to with broad suspicion instead of with narrowly targeted solutions, when people trapped in one position are asked to bear the weight of representing an entire category. It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of reputation, the power of collective judgment, and the way that fear can harden into hatred, even when nobody really intended it to go that far. The miller ground grain into flour, but medieval society ground millers themselves into pariahs, and unlike flour, those millers could never quite be reformed into something palatable again.